I wanted to walk through a pivot table where we are going to complete a Benford's Law analysis. And just to quickly show you some of the pivot table functionality, and the reason I'm going to do this is we're going to ultimately be able to do a pivot chart. And the pivot chart is something that will come off of the table, and it's dynamic in that as you change the pivot table, so does the chart. And I thought it was a nice way to start out explaining graphing and quickly showing you how you could change your graphs, etc. So to create a pivot table, you want to, generally speaking, highlight the data that you have, and then you want to go to Insert Pivot Table, and that will bring up this screen. I'm just going to go through a few of these slides, and then we'll jump into Excel so that we could look at it there. So in getting around the pivot, for the most part, the best way to change the information in your pivot is to right-click on that data, and that tends to help out in quickly being able to change things. And another way, though, to do that is to actually use the ribbon or top menu bar. Whenever you create a pivot table, it doesn't always show up, but the Pivot Table Tools menu item will show up if you have a pivot table and you select the pivot table. So you have to kind of be in there. It will bring up the Pivot Table Tools, and then you can be able to change anything on the pivot table. And really, it is the easiest way, best way to get to everything. And as much as people don't like the ribbon within Excel, I do find that the ribbon is for pivot tabling is second to none. A lot of people utilize it, and I use it the most. It's the best and easiest way to get to the info. As another option, though, you do have the right-clicking and selecting various options, but value field settings is normally a way that you can really adjust. Are you going to count on the item? Are you going to sum on the item? What is the amount field type, etc.? But again, all that can be done with the ribbon. So if we do need to change the number formatting, such as through value field settings, again, done via the ribbon or by right-clicking, this is a common thing to change in pivot tables, and I wanted to make sure everyone saw this. The sum of the amount can be changed to count of the amount, or average of that amount, or max or min, or what have you, and it can make for some very interesting graphing, especially if you want to do like a min and max graph. Now, on the format of cells as well, by selecting the number format option on that option of value field settings, you can get to format cells and be able to change the currency, or if it is, I suppose, a date, you could change it to that as well. But generally you're counting things, so it's numbers that have numbers, or you are doing an accounting or currency change. Once the pivot table is set up, then you can graph, and the pivot chart option, again via the ribbon, is the way to create this dynamic chart, and that will be added, and we'll be walking through not only creating it, but then watching how it changes as we change our data. So as we move into Excel, we have a data file that is an accounts payable data file, and we've added to it in yellow some fields that are calculated: a Benford 1, a Benford 2, and a Benford 3. The Benford 1, just taking that one as an example, it's looking at cell B2, and it's taking that first digit, the leftmost digit, which is this left function B2, for one digit, and that's the left function. Then we can do that for 2 digits and get 26, and we can do it for 3 digits and get 265. And that is this use of left function. What I find with pivot tables, and I think graphing in general, and I'm showing you all of these calculated fields here, what you find is that you tend to want to summarize on a field, be it enterer or day of week or what have you, as opposed to summarizing sometimes on, say, check date. While that can be interesting and can provide you some information, a lot of times you want to start summarizing that by month and year, again, to kind of make sense of it. So I think doing this Benford analysis on the digits, I think, is a really interesting way of looking at your data. It's a digital way of looking at your data as opposed to a time or summary by enterer or vendor or whatever normal summaries that you do. So with that data and with those left functions, I've actually created a pivot chart or pivot table over here and then a pivot chart. So we have everything in here. But let's redo this. And what I will do is I will go to the Insert menu and I will select the Pivot Table option. Generally speaking, the pivot data table feature will select all of your data. However, you might want to just take a look at that. The range obviously is right here, and you can just take a look at that. We're going to send this to a new worksheet. And once we are here, we're presented with a couple of ways of looking at the data and working with it. What I wanted to do is move first down to that Benford 1 position and put that, if I click on it, it tends to go to the row option automatically, but you can click and drag that into here, and I'm pretty sure you could even click and drag it into there as well. So, however you like to kind of click and drag, you can do that. And there's a few different ways of doing this. I mean, one of the ways is to count any of these other fields. I mean, we probably could even do a count of the Benfords Law 1, in this. A lot of times people will put, say, the invoice amount in here as well, into that field, and that would be, say, a sum of the invoice amount. And this may just show relevance. Now, as I said, let's play around with this pivot rather quickly. We can change the value field settings by right-clicking and selecting value field settings, and then we have the option of doing a few things here. But what I'll do is I'll change the number format first and change it to, say, a currency, $ in our case, and 2 places, and that provides us with that sum. We can do the same thing to the count, and again by right-clicking and selecting the value field settings. But I also wanted to show you this Pivot Table Tools ribbon. The Pivot Table Tools ribbon allows you to pretty much handle every part of the action of your pivot table. And one of the things that you could select is field settings, and that will again bring up that field setting for this count field. We'll go to number format, number, no decimal places, and yes, thousand separator. And by clicking OK, that number is also formatted. I do this formatting because I do find in graphs that to have the formatting is almost a requirement, but it is something where it makes it a lot easier to read if things are formatted properly. The one thing that we don't have in this sheet right now is the percentage and getting an idea of how many of these items are showing up in the data. So let me drag this Benford 1 into the analysis one more time. I'm just going to click down here, and I got to get to my field here. Again, I can do this many different ways. I can select the count on Benford 1 field here, go to my Pivot Table Tools, Field Settings. Now this is something a little different. What we want to do is say we want to show values as percentage of column. So we're going to say percentage of this column. How are we, the 2236 divided by 4821, etc. And we can, I guess we can also change the number format, but 2 decimal places percentage looks good to me. Hit OK, and now I have a Benford's Law chart with the actual percentages in there. And notice the first percentage is very high in relation to the number 1 per Benford, which was about 30%. 24 again in relation, so I wanted to show again how to create this. As we go over, I wanted to go over to the one that I've created for you and will be in this data set. I've copied into that one the Benford Law numbers, so you can use it as a bit of a gauge against what you have. And in our case, we're off on every front because this is made up data, and obviously it looks made up. And when you look at the percentages, it is more made up and much different than what is Benford's law. So just going back to our numbers that we've created in this pivot sheet, one of the things I can do just to show you is to click on the Pivot Table Tools menu above and select the Pivot Chart option. And in this case, I mean, there's a few different ways that we could look at this. A lot of people normally select a column chart, so let's select that. Now, what's kind of interesting is the sum on invoice amount. Let me move this to another sheet so it's a little more visible. There's two ways to play with this. I mean, you could have this over here. Let me just move this over here for a second. I mean, two ways to kind of play with your charts here. Just going to get rid of that for a second. Is you can expand this pivot chart to be as big as a screen, and hence something that you can just keep within the pivot table itself. And I sometimes do that, but what I always fear is that this pivot chart will overrun my pivot table will overrun my chart, and it will tend to skew how the chart reads, etc. So a lot of times what I do is I'll right click the chart itself. And again, you can also do this up above here on the pivot chart tools by just saying move chart. But again, the pivot chart tools, pivot table tools, the ribbon tends to do very well in those cases. We can select move chart, and I can move that to a new chart and call this Benford test. And again, let me just looking back at this Benford chart probably isn't the best in that it has mostly the sum of amount coming up, and the sum of amount is not really what I want, so I'm going to take out the sum of amount field. And then now I have the counts of both the percentages, which are these, you could, I think, barely see them. There's probably like a little red line in there. That is the percentage from here. And then this count, the 2,200, as I scroll out here, as you can see, that is the 2,200, the general kind of count. And as you look at Benford's law, let's just go back to what Benford's law looks like as more of a, you can get the idea upside down here, it's very standardized, etc. This one is not. One thing that may be difficult to do, and something to do if in another type of chart exercise, is I wanted to try to get, going back to this Benford numbers, I wanted to try to get these numbers into my chart. And what I realized kind of quickly is that when you're dealing with a pivot chart, it doesn't make it that easy to do that. So the best way to do that is you can copy the information from the chart, say the pivot chart in this case, or from the pivot table, and then that other spreadsheet that we have. And now with this information, you can chart both of these items, and then this would be something that you can look at the differences in that chart. Let's hold off for now on doing that, and as we will do various charts like this, it's basically a two-axis type chart, and we'll do this later in the program. Now, looking back at the Benford test chart, though, one of the things that you could do is to remove the percentage field that is there, and then that will give you just the amount fields alone. So once we have that established and we have it on the one digit, and let me just filter this down so you can see it, one of the nice things that you can do is go back to your pivot table, in this case, click on the pivot table itself, and once we are there, instead of having Benford 1, I mean, you could have Benford 1, but also select Benford 2 in that analysis. And then go back to the Benford test chart. Again, a little hard to read. I mean, there's probably some ways to move this around a bit so that we can make a little bit more sense of it, such as moving, what I did there is I just clicked on the chart object itself, which is right about here, and then you can see again in the 1 series what's showing up, in the 2 series what's showing up, 3 series, etc., as we go through this type of analysis. So that is one approach. And then let me just go back to this. We can then even go to a Benford 3 analysis, but as you probably will imagine, the chart gets a little hard to read at that point. So going back into the actual data file, one way to better look at the information is maybe just to focus on Benford 3 on its own, and then copy those values again into there, or drag those values into the count to create a count effect. Once you have that graph set up, you can go back into your totals, and it looks a little more readable at this point. I mean, if you want to give yourself a little bit of a bellwether of where you are, you could try adding the count 1 to that spreadsheet. It makes it a little harder to read. Let's go backwards here. Let's take Benford 1, Benford 3, and then into the Benford 1 analysis. We'll bring that there to get a count, and go over to Benford test again. At least now you have some idea of where 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7 start. So I think that Benford's law can be shown 1, 2, 3 digit series of analysis and charted in a very quick fashion using pivot tables. And I like it because you can go in and out of, say, 1 or 2 or 3 digits and get an analysis. Now, just in a quick way, now that we know how to build these pivot tables, I wanted to jump over to the pivot amounts tab in your spreadsheet that you'll get. And this is a pivot table. However, this is a pivot table that actually just summarizes on the amount field. So I dragged this amount field into this row area. I then pulled a count of that amount field and then did a sum of that amount field as well. I just dragged those down into here, and that provided this type of analysis. And this can be a more useful way of gaining knowledge on Benford's law, but doing it in a very quick fashion. So a lot of times people will use Benford's law type pivot tables and be able to drill into those pivot tables and ultimately, and then get the numbers that we're looking for, and that's something that we've been talking about here. However, one of the things that you can do is utilize the pivot table to identify those amounts that are showing up the most, and hence will probably drive the pivot table or pivot chart to be off in relation to Benford's law. So a way to find that is to sort the pivot table. Now, you could use the sort option above in the pivot table tools. However, I tend to like to utilize the sort options in the pivot table because it gets a bit advanced as to what you're doing when you're sorting in a pivot. So let me show you. If I right click on any row in the table, we do have the sort, and I like to go to more sort options just so I have an idea of what I'm doing. And I'm going to say I don't want to sort by invoice amount or like that, but I do want to sort descending by the count of invoice amount. And by doing that, I can identify the items that are showing up the most in this chart. And now that I want to look at that, I can double click on that pivot table and get down into the actual numbers. And I generally will pick samples, samples for Benford's law using this approach, although there's nothing to prevent you from going back to the pivot table chart here as an example in this Benford's law analysis. It's a little tough in that you have to just highlight this field to be able to get it, but 119 is showing up very, very highly there. I can go into my sheet 1, kind of scroll down to 119, and even though there's not that many of them, I guess it does show up quite highly there, and you can double click on that set of items and then get how those items show up in the actual data.